What if there was a way to bring back extinct species like the woolly mammoth or even dinosaurs? Should we? And who should decide that? Here to talk about the science and the ethics of doing so is journalist Britt Wray, whose new book is Rise of the Necrofauna: The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction. Welcome, Britt.
Thank you.
It's really nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you.
So when we think of extinct animals coming back to life, we think of dinosaurs a la Jurassic Park. Let's take a look.
It's a dinosaur.
I don't know if it's the music, but when you watch that piece, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. Where probably we should be more terrified if we were able to see something like that. So you talk about necrofauna and the de-extinction in your book. Does that mean that we can actually bring back dinosaurs?
We cannot bring back dinosaurs, for better or for worse. And that's because they've been gone for nearly 66 million years. And that's far too long to be able to salvage any good usable bits of DNA from their fossilized remains. But when there are more recently extinct species, such as a passenger pigeon or a woolly mammoth, there are ways that we can actually extract DNA from their remnants and then map out their genome in order to do the real work that de-extinction depends on.
We're going to talk more about that and also about what the public's position should be in this conversation. But you write that writing this book was an ethical consideration for you. What did you mean by that?
That's true.
Yeah.
De-extinction is very controversial. We don't know if it will have the intended effect that some scientists want it to in terms of restoring holes in ecosystems that have been reaped when certain important species that had functional roles to play disappeared. Perhaps we will actually endanger ecosystems by bringing in new species that change them towards unintended effects. There's also a lot of legal issues, animal welfare concerns, and so when writing the book, was interviewing a variety of experts on the different pros and cons, and some people condemned me for writing this book. They thought it was dangerous, that I'm adding a narrative to the pile that could get the public more used to the idea that we could create proxies or close versions of extinct species, because they think that it's a bad thing for conservation. So in that sense, it was an ethical issue that I am doing something to get people to understand and think about this concept when it's not yet understood if it's going to have positive or negative effects.
And in the book, you write, if taken without scrutiny, the term de-extinction, as it is widely used, suggests that reversing extinction might actually be achievable. That idea, however, is a sham. In no way can we ever undo the erasure of an entire way of life. So why write the book?
Okay, interesting point. So yes, de-extinction as a term is a bit misleading because it suggests that we can get a carbon copy of the original extinct species back, that we could get this identical form. And we can't do that. However, we can cobble bits of the extinct species together in a new animal that can resemble the extinct species, which is fascinating science in itself, and it opens up a totally new paradigm of scientific work. So we can use cloning or backbreeding or gene editing to make these new types of animals that have the traits of extinct species. And the ones that people are working on are, there's a variety of them, but I thought that it was fascinating and also troubling because of the many issues it raises, which is why I wrote the book.
Well, you mentioned the tools, I guess, that we can use to make the science possible, cloning, gene editing, and backbreeding. Can you go through them and explain to us what that means, what those individual terms mean?
Sure. Yeah. So cloning is the process that gave us the famous adult animal clone Dolly the sheep years ago that many people will be familiar with, and it's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. Here you can get a very, very close version of an identical copy of a species back, but not 100% identical. And it's because it relies on taking a cell from the animal that you want to clone. This has actually happened once before with an extinct animal. This is the only de-extinction case to date that has been followed through. So it was a bucardo, also known as the Pyrenean ibex, and how they cloned this species back to life is basically by taking a cell from the last individual, which had died, But before it died, cells were taken from the flank and the ears of the animal and frozen very quickly on liquid nitrogen. Then you have a perfectly preserved cell with the nucleus inside, which is the package that contains most of its DNA, perfectly intact. You can yank the nucleus out of that cell from the animal to be cloned and take an egg cell from a close relative, another living type of goat. You remove its native nucleus and replace it with the nucleus that has most of the DNA of the animal to be cloned. You stimulate it to start dividing with an electroshock and implant it in a surrogate mother, where in that uterus it will develop, if all goes well, into the clone. It takes a lot of trial and error usually, but then you can get an animal that is a close replicate of the extinct one.
And so backbreeding would be then?
Backbreeding is very similar to how we bred dogs from wolves, for example. You can think about artificial selection techniques where you just choose individual animals that have the traits you want and cross them together over many generations. However, when you've got an extinct animal, such as the aurochs, which is the ancestor of all of today's living cattle, that cow is no longer here, went extinct in the 1600s, but all of today's living cattle are its descendants. So you figure then that its genome is still on the planet, sprinkled along those descendants in their genomes. So you can select the cows today that have the right horn shape and coloration, for example, that are similar to the extinct ancestor, and then cross them together over many generations until you basically breed back in time to get a cow that looks and can maybe act like the extinct one.
But it's not the extinct one.
Exactly, it's kind of skin deep de-extinction.
Right.
Yes.
Let's go back to some other terms.
Okay.
I want to get into, we've mentioned de-extinction a couple of times.
Right.
What does that mean?
Right, okay, perfect. This is an important question. De-extinction is the process of creating a facsimile or a close version of an extinct species through these methods of gene editing, cloning, or backbreeding. It is a term that is a little bit confusing because it says that we can undo extinction, but we can't. We are instead creating a new animal that resembles an extinct species.
And unextinction.
Unextinction, okay, yeah, so the terms are all a little bit sloppy and confusing. De-extinction is this process that I talked about of creating this proxy animal, but an unextinct animal, in the way that I write about it and some others in the field, is the process at the end of it, that the animal created is unextinct.
So this past fall, we mentioned the three terms like cloning, gene editing, and backbreeding. And this past fall, scientists announced a new ability in gene editing. How would that work to enable, what would that enable them to do with de-extinction?
Yes, the gene editing is a whole other approach to doing de-extinction. And here there are tools that scientists can use, such as CRISPR-Cas9, a very celebrated gene editing tool since 2012, that allow you to target a specific gene in any animal's genome. It also works in plants and microbes, in humans. And you can go in with molecular scissors, essentially, that are enzymes that can detect a certain gene sequence you want to cut it, and you can even replace a gene with new genetic material. So it becomes an in and out gene tailoring system. However, just recently, there was a publication showing that these gene editing tools became a lot more precise. So instead of doing whole chunks of genetic code at a time, you can actually snip out a single base of DNA. And DNA is a molecule that comes with these 4 nucleotide bases, and you see them as letters on, these forensic science shows like CSI, A, T, C, and G. And here we have very precise gene editing tools now that allow you to switch a T to an A, or a C to a G, or a G to an A, and so on.
So fascinating. You've mentioned a couple of the animals like aurochs and the bucardos. Which animals would make ideal candidates for de-extinction?
This is a topic of hot debate. So what does it mean to choose a candidate responsibly for de-extinction? Are we just going to create animals that make us feel good some way, that are very beautiful, majestic, look back at us with a spark of intelligence, and that we can galvanize a lot of public interest around? Or are we going to choose those species that might have the best ecosystem effect? The International Union for the Conservation of Nature is a global authority on endangered species. They manage the Red List, which tells us how endangered certain species are. And they have said, de-extinction is coming down the pipe. It's going to happen, and we need to get ahead of the ball and think about how to select candidates. So they made these guidelines, which are not legally enforceable, but they will be taken very seriously by policymakers because of their authority. And they're basically creating levels of scrutiny that an animal needs to pass through in order to be considered a good candidate. So is there available habitat? Likely this depends on the animal not having gone extinct that long ago, so the habitat hasn't totally changed or been destroyed. Is it subject to change from climate change, for example, in the foreseeable future? Is it under threat from that, or human communities wanting to develop the land? Is there food available, other biotic factors? Can we make sure that humans won't find the species to be of commercial interest and they'll want to hunt it or produce a market around it in an unecological way? Because of the high degree of genetic engineering involved to make a lot of these animals, they will be patentable in many areas around the world.
That would create other problems, right?
Exactly, yes. So there's actually a very complex layered analysis you need to go through in order to figure out, okay, is this a wise choice, or might we get caught along the way and endanger these animals again should they be brought back?
And who do you think should make those decisions?
I think it should be a global discussion that involves all of us. People working in this field are open and interested in transparency, and they want us to weigh in. But not a lot of us actually know about this and the fact that it's happening. And it is a relatively fringe activity. There are still just a handful of labs around the world working on it. However, there's some really heavy hitters who are making this happen. So conservationists and synthetic biologists, ecologists, environmental historians, legal scholars, these are the people who are working on it today. But this is affecting our ecosystems. I mean, there are plans in place to reintroduce some of these animals into fairly populated areas such as eastern North America, the forest where the passenger pigeon used to roam. So if we get hundreds of millions of recreated passenger pigeons back there, at some point it will be in places where all of us who are living there should have a say.
How did the passenger pigeon become extinct in the first place?
It's an amazing story. This bird was so populous that it flocked in the billions. It's really hard.
It was like a curtain above, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was just this draping of pigeons flying so thick that it would take 14 hours for a single flock to sometimes pass overhead. And when hunters would go out and shoot one bullet up in the sky, anywhere between 25 and 99 birds could drop down. They were that copious. It's really hard to imagine. But they went from billions to none in effectively less than 50 years because of market hunting. We found them to be a very cheap, good, reliable source of protein. We'd go into their colonies and smoke them out and stuff them into barrels and preserve them with salts and ship them on rail lines all over North America where they were sold. And apparently we liked the fatty young squab the best. We thought they tasted good. And so they were just so present everywhere that we could catch them in so many different ways, and it meant that we could make them go extinct, unfortunately, very quickly. And in 1914, the last individual, Martha, named after George Washington's wife, the last passenger pigeon, died at the Cincinnati Zoo.
There seems to be a real interest to bringing it back. Why the passenger pigeon?
So this is a project of a scientist named Ben Novak, who has been very passionate about this bird since he was 13 when he read about it in a book.
That's pretty cool, 13.
Yes, yeah. Yes. He discovered that there were these flocks that sounded mythical, and he was a huge Tolkien fan at that time, and his heart was lit ablaze, and there was a science fair at his school at that time, and he made his project about bringing back the passenger pigeon and what that might mean. Now he's my age, and he's the lead scientist on what's called the Great Comeback of the Passenger Pigeon, which is a project by Revive and Restore. This is a nonprofit organization that's pushing a lot of the de-extinction work forward, including the Woolly Mammoth Project at Harvard. And so he and the other advocates of de-extinction that promote the passenger pigeon say that what we want them to do is come back and flock in the forests where they used to live in the eastern parts of North America in huge numbers to cause the forest disturbance that they used to. You can imagine that that many pigeons acted like a superorganism. They had a devastating effect wherever they would land. And forests today in these areas generally have a closed canopy. So the branches are all interweaving, and that blocks a lot of the sunlight from coming down, penetrating through and hitting the forest floor. When forest floors are open to sunlight, new shoots and roots regenerate there. So by having pigeons come in and break all the branches and scratch off the bark, that can open up the canopy and allow new life to sprout down below, which would then become denser again over the year until the pigeons came back to roost the following year. This is the kind of life cycle that they, through the natural history of the areas, believe the pigeons had there. We know that forests get regenerated around the world today by a variety of disturbances, tornadoes, hailstorms, fires. And so they argue that having a bunch of pigeons back to regenerate the forests of eastern North America would be a desirable way to allow them to have more ecosystem productivity.
So it sounds like a lot of the de-extinction motivation would be to restore ecosystems that have been changed because the animals are no longer, the species is no longer there.
Exactly right.
And is that one of the reasons why there seems to be this like push for the woolly mammoth? Because for me, I'm like, there's so many elephants around the world that are on the verge of becoming extinct. Why focus on something that's already gone?
Absolutely, yes. So those working on the woolly mammoth say, we care about conservation, we should diversify our interests. Yes, work on endangered elephants, but also think about how woolly mammoths might help ecosystems, or consider that creating a woolly mammoth elephant hybrid might be a way of imbuing elephants with woolly mammoth traits that allow them to live in new habitats, such as the far north and the Arctic and Siberia, that elephants currently aren't in, so you can get biodiversity from the elephant genome into new areas. But looking at the woolly mammoth simply as an experimental woolly mammoth project, the idea is that by using gene editing to have an intervention in Asian elephant cells, where you can take an Asian elephant embryo and genetically tweak it so that its genes effectively get turned into woolly mammoth-specific traits, because we have mapped the genome of the extinct woolly mammoth. We've got really great quality information about what genetic variants coded for that thick, iconic, shaggy mane it had, and things like the smaller ears compared to elephants that would allow less heat to escape when it was living in really cold environments, as well as, importantly, the ability to bind and release oxygen in its blood at freezing temperatures. Then, by changing the elephant genome into one that has these traits, you can effectively implant that embryo in a surrogate mother elephant to raise it, or they're also at Harvard in George Church's lab developing artificial womb technology, because they say, well, yes, let's face it, elephants aren't doing very well, so we should leave elephant wombs free to make more elephants rather than these experimental
Because their gestation
animals.
period for elephants is like, what, 2 years or something?
Yes, 22 months, so almost 2 years. It's quite long. So if you had a bunch of artificial wombs and you grew a bunch of these gene-edited embryos in parallel, you could make many woolly mammoth elephant hybrids fairly quickly. And then the explanation about what this could do for ecosystems is related to climate change. So it's not super intuitive, but when you think about it, it's quite fascinating proposal. So woolly mammoths used to live in places like the Yukon, far north, and Siberia. If you think of those areas today, there are huge swaths of land full of permafrost. And that permafrost contains millennia's worth of animals that have died and fallen into the ground, as well as, importantly, the vegetation that those animals fed on. So that's a bunch of carbon material. But we're learning that permafrost is actually a pretty bad word for the material itself, because it's not permanently frozen because of global warming. It's heating and thawing what was once frozen. And as that happens, this carbon content gets released into the atmosphere, which becomes quite dangerous because there are microbes everywhere that chew away at the stuff and turn it into carbon dioxide or methane, which are two of the greenhouse gases that got us into the warming predicament we're currently in. So this creates a feedback loop of just increased warming. And so many scientists are thinking, how can we innovatively keep that permafrost solidly frozen to lock the carbon in? Now, back in the Pleistocene, when mammoths were most populous there were millions of large hoofed animals running around and punching holes in the snow. Today, that snow has a lot less bioactivity because there's a lot less of these animals with that kind of heft running around. So there's a big, thick, insulating blanket of snow that keeps things warmer than they otherwise would be if you had a bunch of mobile ventilating systems, these big, hefty animals punching holes in the snow that allow this tube for cycling cold air from the atmosphere down to the top of the soil to keep things frozen. So this is the idea that if we had, for example, 80,000 recreated woolly mammoths, or if you think about it another way, elephants that are able to now live in the cold because they are imbued with those traits, you put them up in Siberia, they can create a new role that can engineer that ecosystem to become somewhat colder. They would also, because we know elephants are quite aggressive, and presumably with these woolly mammoth traits too, they could be as well, they'd knock over dark plants that absorb the sun's heat. They would be able to fertilize the soil with their dung to create light, grassy, steppe-like environment, such as what there was over 10,000 years ago, and that would reflect some of the sunlight. So the idea is that there would be a complex interweaving of ecosystem roles that they could play out to make things generally like what it used to be.
And how close are researchers to bringing back the woolly mammoth?
George Church has predicted that possibly by 2019, give or take, they will have edited all of the genes that they want from the woolly mammoth into Asian elephant embryos. So that's just having the cell in the state you want in order to then do implantation. Then they could, if their artificial womb technology is working, start to grow these embryos in those artificial wombs, or potentially use surrogates of some animal to gestate 22 months. And then, if it all works, you would have to wait, say, about 16 years for those animals to reach sexual maturity and to procreate themselves in terms of watching their life cycle.
That's a long list of ifs that have to come together for it to actually happen.
Right.
So if we have this pressing issue of climate change, we also have another pressing issue of animals becoming extinct every year. So why focus on de-extinction when we should be focusing on preserving or conserving the animals that we have right now that are on the verge of becoming extinct?
Personally, that is my take. I think we should be using these biotechnologies to focus on currently endangered species, which many people are increasingly starting to do. What's really amazing and I think productive about de-extinction and the conversation around it is that it's brought synthetic biology, so a field full of high-tech tools for bioengineering and modifying life forms, to talk with conservation biology, which is a much more traditionalist field that hasn't been using genetic engineering historically, and it's creating a nexus. And it's brought these experts into the same room to talk about what might it mean to focus on the biodiversity crisis we're currently in and leveraging these types of tools towards endangered species, wildlife diseases, and in some cases, extinct species. And many people argue that that's worthwhile. Many people say that this is a moral hazard, that we should not be thinking about recreating biodiversity of extinct animals when we have so much biodiversity currently threatened that we need to mobilize around saving now.
Stuart Brent, who is he?
Stuart Brent is a visionary writer, environmentalist. He's been part of culture on the West Coast in the United States, Bay Area for many, many years. He's done things such as coin the term personal computer. He used to publish the Whole Earth Catalog, which is this classic countercultural beacon of a publication that people like Steve Jobs said were his Bible before Google was around.
And we talked about the public's involvement in this whole conversation around de-extinction. We have a clip from Stuart Brent's TED Talk, and I'd like to show it to you now.
So where do we go from here? These have been private meetings so far. I think it's time for the subject to go public. What do people think about it? Do you want extinct species back? Do you want extinct species back?
That response was kind of meh. What do you think upsets people about the idea of de-extinction?
So Stuart Brand runs this organization I mentioned, Revive and Restore, which he created with his wife, and they are a de-extinction advocacy group, essentially, and they're the ones mobilizing these projects. And yes, when he puts it out to people, do you want extinct species back? And some people are like, kind of. Some people say, yeah, it's so cool, and others say, no way. And I've discovered through writing the book that no one is meh about de-extinction. It really polarizes people. They say, this is fascinating, this can change the narrative, this can give us hope about biodiversity in the future, let my kids understand that potentially they will be able to see polar bears throughout their entire life, for example, because we've got these high-tech tools. Others think this is really a sham. This is a huge distraction. This is a techno fix, it's a Band-Aid, it's not allowing us to do the deep political work that we need to really save species, which is to stop pillaging their habitats, which is to not play favorites about which species are cute and worth the while and really work to raise all biodiversity together.
And we kind of touched on it a little bit in our earlier in the conversation, because you are editing the genes, that people can actually say, that's my creation, I want to copyright that. Is there some thinking going on how to approach this if it happens?
Yes, interesting. So because there's a lot of genetic engineering in the production to make some of these unextinct animals, in, for example, a place like the United States, their legal system says, if you see a specimen and it's considered a product of nature, it can't be patented. But if there's a clear inventive step, such as genetic engineering to make it happen, then it should be patentable. And legal precedents show that this has happened many times. Bioengineered species can be patented, which means that the person holding that patent can profit by licensing the patent to others who may want to use it for a variety of different reasons. And this opens up a lot of questions about how the idea of de-extinction being used to restore ecosystem health could actually be perversely twisted to allow people to profit in different ways. New markets for tourism, or I've had some people talk about exotic pet trade, or even new ways to eat if you're a certain type of glamorous foodie. So it would be ridiculous to go to the extent of bringing back an extinct species just to eat a salted mammoth leg, for example. However, we know that
it could happen.
It could happen, and there are interesting cases where just because we have a threatened population of a species that's basically endangered, such as the American bison, which was just hanging by a thread in the 19th century, and we were trying desperately to restore them, and we eventually succeeded, and now there are many. But the whole time that they were being conserved, there were also populations of them bred just to be able to turn them into bison burgers. So we were conserving the threatened species while eating them. And we see with de-extinction, there are already business models in place, for example, with the extinct aurochs backbreeding project that involves slaughtering the males to sell their wilderness meat. So there's different ways that people think about using unextinct animals.
You mentioned that there was a baby bucardo who was brought back. I guess extinct, would that be the terminology that you would use? Or
So, interesting. Okay, yes, it's confusing.
Yeah.
So it was de-extincted to produce an unextinct bucardo.
But we really didn't hear about it. Do you think that that's why it's so quiet, because of the reaction that people might have?
That was quite a while ago. That was in the early 2000s. So it did splash when it happened, but then it, went through a news cycle and kind of fell out of consciousness. And so I think that there are increasingly more and more people paying attention to this, but generally the reality is that it's a relatively fringe activity. There are some, radical sounding projects that are underway, but as a whole society, we are not totally aware of what's going on in labs all around the world.
Britt, thanks so much for being here. You've given us a lot to think about, and it's a fantastic read.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.